Marcus Williams, only 16, had spent weeks perfecting his science project, but when he unveiled it, the teacher froze. The room applauded the white student who copied Marcus's idea, while Marcus was accused of cheating. His project wasn't dismissed because it failed, it was dismissed because he built it, and in just one moment, the truth that could expose everything was in his hands. The question was, would anyone believe him before it was too late? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The lecture hall was built like a fortress of intellect. Marble floors, polished wooden desks curved in a grand semicircle, lights recessed high in the ceiling, casting an ivory glow across the crowded rows. Dozens of graduate students scribbled into thick notepads, laptops hummed quietly, and the quiet rustle of anticipation filled the air. It wasn't just another lecture, this was the seminar where impossibilities were dissected, and careers were made by proving them wrong. At the very center, commanding the space like a conductor before an orchestra, stood Professor Arthur Caldwell. He was a man of iron posture, sharp spectacles that glimmered with cold precision, and a reputation so untouchable that to question him was almost a career suicide. His words carried weight, not because they were kind, but because they were final. And somewhere in the back row, tucked into a seat too large for his small frame, sat Malik Thompson, 12 years old, barely tall enough for his eyes to peek over the edge of the desk. His sneakers didn't touch the floor, they dangled in the empty space beneath him, quietly swinging as if trying to find gravity. No one noticed him at first, or maybe they noticed and chose not to see. In a room full of white and Asian graduate students dressed in pressed blazers and sharp collars, Malik's presence, his dark skin, his small body, his oversized hoodie with a fading NBA logo, felt like a misplaced comma in an otherwise carefully edited sentence. The kind of presence people skimmed over, too uncomfortable to confront, too easy to ignore. Professor Caldwell's chalk scraped against the green board with harsh certainty. "And this, ladies and gentlemen," he declared, voice thick with the rhythm of authority, "is why the hypothesis is impossible." The word landed heavy, echoing, "Impossible." Heads nodded in unison. Students scribbled. A few typed the word into their laptops, underlining it twice. Caldwell's voice never trembled. Impossibility wasn't just a statement for him, it was law, and he stood as judge, jury, and executioner. But Malik's heart began to pound. Because while the rest of the hall bowed to the word impossible, he knew with the certainty of a truth that gnawed at him night after night, that Caldwell was wrong. Malik had spent weeks poring over the problem at home, surrounded by the clutter of a small apartment where his mother worked late shifts and his textbooks were hand-me-downs bought from thrift stores. He'd filled notebook after notebook with scribbles and calculations, chasing the very idea the professor had now crushed in a single word. He felt the burn in his chest, the electricity of knowing something no one expected him to know. Yet around him, the silence of dismissal was louder than his heartbeat. The students leaned forward in admiration of the professor, their pens moving obediently. None of them saw the boy at the back, fists pressed against his knees, lips parting as though he wanted to speak, but didn't. He was invisible. He was always invisible. Caldwell turned, dusting chalk from his fingertips, surveying the hall as if daring anyone to question him. His reputation was built on these performances, a masterclass in shutting down inquiry, ensuring his students learned that to think beyond his frame was dangerous. "Now, if any of you," he said, tone almost mocking, "believe otherwise, I invite you to speak, but I assure you, you'll find yourself in the company of ghosts and failures." Laughter rippled softly across the room, and Malik shrank for a moment, his small frame sinking deeper into the chair. He knew the laugh. He'd heard it on playgrounds, when teachers ignored him, in classrooms where his raised hand went unanswered, in moments where his skin spoke louder than his words ever could. But something in him, something sharper than fear, resisted. Maybe it was his mother's voice from last night, tired but steady as she folded laundry. "Baby, if you know something, don't let this world silence you. They'll try, but your voice matters." Maybe it was the notebooks under his bed, pages inked with equations no one had ever asked to see, equations that lived only in his head, equations that lit fires he couldn't put out. Or maybe it was the look on Caldwell's face, that smug certainty, that made Malik's pulse quicken until his hands trembled. The word impossible echoed again in his ears. But in Malik's world, impossible had never meant the same thing. Impossible was the landlord raising rent when his mom's paycheck didn't stretch. Impossible was a school counselor telling her that maybe Malik should slow down instead of getting ahead. Impossible was every locked door he wasn't supposed to open. And yet, here he was, in this lecture hall, listening to a man call something impossible, when Malik knew deep down it wasn't. His fingers gripped the edge of his desk, small knuckles pale under the pressure. He felt the room spinning, every whisper of chalk against board, every soft chuckle pressing him back into silence. He thought of leaving it alone, just sitting there, letting the words swallow him, like it had swallowed so many before. He thought of saving himself from humiliation, from the smirks and stares that would surely follow if he dared open his mouth. But then, a flicker, a memory, his grandmother's voice when she tucked him in as a child. "They'll tell you to wait your turn, Malik. But sometimes, if you wait too long, your turn never comes." His hand twitched. The voices blurred. The professor's monologue stretched into a haze of authority, and Malik's small body, almost without his own permission, began to straighten. His sneakers stopped swinging. His shoulders squared, though still trembling. And his hand, small, dark, shaking, lifted slowly into the air. The room didn't notice at first, too consumed by Caldwell's voice, too convinced of the word impossible. But when they did, when the first row of students turned, brows furrowed in confusion, their eyes trailing upward to the back row, a hush spread like smoke. One by one, faces shifted. Curiosity, then disbelief, then something sharper, something closer to insult. Because it wasn't just any hand raised. It was the hand of a child, a black child, seated in a room where no one like him was meant to be seen. Caldwell paused mid-sentence. His gaze lifted, sharp and cutting, to the back row. His lips pressed into a thin line, as though the very sight of Malik's hand was an intrusion, an interruption, a crime. And for one suspended moment, the room froze. Every eye locked on Malik. Every whisper died. The boy's hand stayed raised, trembling, but unyielding. And the air grew heavier, as though the next breath the professor took would decide everything. The boy slowly raises his hand, the room holding its breath. The air in the lecture hall seemed to thicken around Malik's raised hand. The stillness was suffocating, but his mind drifted back to moments where this wasn't new, where silence had been forced on him long before this grand room full of scholars. Because Malik had lived a childhood where silence wasn't just expected, it was demanded. From the very first day of kindergarten, Malik's brilliance had been an inconvenience. While other children stumbled over the alphabet, Malik traced letters with precision, reading storybooks that his mother brought home from the thrift store. But instead of praise, he was often told, "Slow down, Malik. Let the others catch up." It became a refrain that followed him like a shadow. On the playground, when he spotted patterns in games that others missed, kids laughed, called him weird, pushed him aside when he tried to explain. At first he thought it was just teasing, the kind children tossed around, but then he noticed the difference. When another child, white or light-skinned, said something smart, the teachers smiled, encouraged it. When Malik spoke, brows furrowed. The teachers redirected. "Let someone else answer. Malik, give them a chance. Give them a chance. Wait your turn." It carved into him, year by year. By fourth grade, Malik had memorized the routine. His hand would rise, and the teacher's eyes would skim past it, settling on someone else. He'd learned not to argue, not to push back. But at home, he filled notebook after notebook, his mother buying stacks of them every payday even when money was tight. He solved puzzles long past his grade level, drew diagrams, asked questions no one in his school wanted to answer. His mother saw it. Every evening, after working 12-hour shifts as a nursing aide, she'd sit with him at their small kitchen table, the sound of the refrigerator humming in the background, while he spilled out equations and ideas. She didn't understand them all, but she understood him. "You got something special in you, Malik," she'd whisper, stroking his head, exhaustion in her eyes but pride in her voice. "Don't let anybody make you feel smaller than you are." But the world had already decided his size. Teachers called him disruptive when he tried to explain a concept they hadn't yet introduced. Counselors suggested he might have attention problems, because he finished work too quickly and got restless waiting for others. One even suggested he should be placed in a program that better matches his maturity, code words Malik's mother instantly recognized. Programs where kids like Malik disappeared, tucked away, tracked downward. And through it all, Malik learned the subtle rules. Keep quiet, keep your head down, don't outshine, don't disrupt. Yet brilliance has a way of clawing itself into the open. By 10, Malik had already advanced beyond middle school math. He solved problems scribbled on scraps of paper, whispering to himself in the quiet corners of their apartment. But when his teacher discovered the pages tucked in his desk, she frowned, not impressed. "Malik, this isn't part of the assignment. You need to stay focused. Stay focused. Stay in line. Stay invisible." It was no wonder then that sitting in the lecture hall now, Malik felt the weight of every time he had been told to hold back. Every dismissive glance, every smirk, every redirected question had built to this moment. Because here he was, in a room designed for minds much older than his, and still the instinct pressed hard on his chest. Don't speak. Don't make a scene. But he couldn't stop remembering one moment, the one that had changed everything. It was at a district math competition a year earlier. Malik had breezed through the written portion, placing first by a wide margin. When it came time for the oral round, where participants had to solve problems on stage, Malik raised his hand confidently. The moderator looked startled, not by his answer, but by him. "Are you sure you're in the right division?" the man had asked in front of everyone, his tone sharp, doubting. "Yes," Malik had whispered, but his voice shook. The moderator turned to one of the judges, both men exchanging a glance that said what they didn't dare out loud. How could this little black boy possibly belong here? Though Malik answered every question correctly, though his score was higher than anyone else's, they announced another winner. The excuse was a clerical error. His mother had protested, demanded an explanation, but was met with tight smiles and apologies that meant nothing. Malik had walked away holding his mother's hand, his heart breaking with the knowledge that no matter how right he was, the world could still erase him. That memory haunted him now. Because as Professor Caldwell's word impossible echoed in the hall, Malik heard all those other words layered beneath it. Words from playgrounds, classrooms, competitions. Words that had one common thread: silence. He had been silenced long enough. And yet, something else rose in his mind. A twist he hadn't expected. It wasn't just his own voice he was carrying. His notebooks under the bed weren't just numbers and symbols. They were conversations with ghosts of brilliance before him. Black scholars, whose names his teachers rarely mentioned. Mathematicians and thinkers, whose work had been overshadowed or outright stolen. Malik had found them in library books his classmates never touched. Benjamin Banneker, Katherine Johnson, Elbert Frank Cox. Each one had walked into rooms where they weren't welcome. Each one had been told to wait their turn. And suddenly, Malik understood. This wasn't just about him proving Caldwell wrong. This was about proving that boys like him, children dismissed, told to shrink, told to be patient while others passed, could no longer be ignored. The lecture hall air grew tighter. The silence was louder. Malik's arm trembled in the air, but he didn't lower it. He felt the weight of his childhood pressing down. Every silenced moment condensed into this single gesture. And then, the unexpected twist. A voice whispered from the front row. Is that a kid?" The question cut through the hall, shattering the hush. Heads turned sharply. Murmurs broke out. Laptops stopped clicking. Students leaned sideways, craning their necks to see. It wasn't just that Malik had raised his hand. It was that for the first time the room acknowledged he was there. The professor's jaw tightened. His eyes sharpened behind his glasses, narrowing at Malik, as though the boy's hand itself were an act of rebellion. And Malik, small but unflinching, kept it raised. Because now, in front of the nation's top professor, in front of a room that had tried not to see him, his silence could no longer hold. Now placed in front of the nation's top professor, his silence can no longer hold. The murmurs in the lecture hall had become a low, unsettling hum. Malik's raised hand hovered like a question mark against the silence, trembling but firm, demanding recognition in a space where children were meant to be invisible. Dozens of eyes pierced into him, some curious, some mocking, others filled with quiet irritation. At the center of it all stood Professor Caldwell. He didn't rush to acknowledge the boy. No, he let the silence linger, savoring the unease, letting it swell until it was unbearable. Then, with deliberate slowness, he tilted his head, adjusted his glasses, and allowed his gaze to travel up to the back row, where Malik sat. And he smirked. It wasn't a kind smile, or even a polite one. It was the thin, knowing curl of lips worn by someone who saw not a student, but an intruder. It was the expression of a man who believed he already knew the value of the boy. and had judged it insignificant. With a flick of his hand, Caldwell dismissed him. "Not today, son," he said, his voice sharp, patronizing, cutting across the stillness like a blade. "This isn't elementary school. Sit quietly, and let the real scholars work." The words landed like stones. The hall erupted in soft laughter, restrained enough to show respect for the professor, loud enough to sting. A ripple of chuckles rolled through the rows, heads turning toward Malik, eyes glimmering with a cruel kind of amusement. The sound burrowed into Malik's chest, each note another reminder that in their eyes he was a child playing dress-up in a world too big for him. His cheeks burned, his throat tightened. Every instinct told him to shrink, to drop his hand, to let the moment pass before it crushed him entirely. He thought of all the times he had been told to wait his turn, all the times teachers had ignored him, all the times laughter had drowned out his voice. This was no different, only louder, sharper, more humiliating. But something inside him, something fierce and unyielding, refused to bend. His hand stayed raised, and in that simple refusal, a quiet defiance sparked. Caldwell's smirk faltered, just slightly. The chuckles from the students began to fade, curiosity slipping in where amusement had been. Malik's persistence unsettled them. The boy didn't look away. He didn't lower his hand. He sat small but resolute, eyes steady, daring the silence to swallow him whole. Caldwell straightened, his voice dripping with condescension. "You must be confused," he said, loud enough for the entire hall to hear. "This is not the space for, well, let's say for children to play hero." The question was rhetorical. "I don't need interruptions." The word interruptions echoed cruelly, stripped of humanity, reducing Malik to a disruption rather than a person. Yet Malik didn't flinch. His fingers curled tighter, his arms stiff, the tremor in his body replaced by a steel he didn't know he had. His silence spoke louder than any words could. And that silence, that refusal to vanish, unsettled the professor more than any protest might have. Because in Malik's stillness was something Caldwell had not expected: dignity. The room shifted. Students who had laughed seconds before began to watch differently. Some leaned forward, eyes narrowing, as though trying to understand why the boy wouldn't relent. Others glanced nervously at Caldwell, sensing a tension that wasn't supposed to exist in his kingdom of control. Then an unexpected twist. From the second row a voice whispered, soft, almost hesitant, but enough to carry in the hush. "Maybe he knows something." It wasn't shouted. It wasn't bold. But it cracked the perfect wall of dismissal. Heads turned again, this time not to mock, but to consider, what if the boy really did have something to say? Caldwell froze for a fraction of a second, his control slipping. The idea that his authority might be questioned by a child, no less, was intolerable. He barked a short, humorless laugh. "Knows something? Don't be absurd. Knowledge requires discipline, years of study, maturity." His gaze darted back to Malik, hard as steel. "He's a spectator, nothing more." But Malik still did not lower his hand. Every second that passed tightened the pressure in the room. The laughter had died completely now. All that remained was the sound of Malik's breathing, shallow but steady, his arm a small pillar of rebellion, and beneath it all, a memory churned in him. He was 8 years old, sitting in a classroom, when a teacher had accused him of cheating on a test. His answers had been too perfect, too advanced, and rather than believe he could do the work, she had assumed dishonesty. His mother had fought for him, demanded the school review his work, and eventually he was cleared, but the sting remained. Even when he was right, the world was ready to believe he was wrong. Now the same feeling pulsed through him. The professor didn't see his mind, only his skin, his age, his place in the world. To Caldwell, Malik was not a possibility, he was an impossibility. But Malik had lived with impossibility his whole life, and impossibility had never stopped him. Caldwell's voice grew colder, sharper. "Put your hand down, boy. Don't make a fool of yourself." The command sliced through the room. Every student waited for Malik to obey. It would have been easier, safer, to drop his hand, sink into the seat, disappear again. But Malik thought of his mother, her voice echoing in his memory. "If you know something, don't let this world silence you." He thought of the notebooks stacked under his bed, of the equations that had consumed his nights, of the truth that burned in his chest even as humiliation pressed down on him. And so he didn't move. His hand remained high, a defiance that was both quiet and thunderous. The professor's smirk vanished entirely now, replaced with something harder, something dangerous, fear masked as anger. Because Caldwell had built his empire on certainty, and nothing threatened certainty more than a challenge he couldn't easily crush. The silence stretched, unbearable, each second heavier than the last. And then Caldwell spoke again, this time lower, more deliberate. "You want to embarrass yourself, child." His words were laced with venom, but his composure was cracking. "Go ahead. Say what you think you know. The room will learn a valuable lesson in why brilliance cannot be faked." The students shifted uneasily. The challenge had been thrown. Malik's arm ached, but he did not lower it. His lips parted, his breath catching. He had spent a lifetime being told to wait, to shrink, to hide. But not this time. This time, he would not be silenced. The boy refuses to lower his hand. The lecture hall had fallen into a silence so thick it almost seemed alive. Every breath, every movement, every whispered shuffle of paper sounded louder than it should. Malik's arm trembled from the weight of holding it aloft. But still he didn't lower it. His small hand cut through the air like a crack in glass, fragile but unyielding, daring the professor's dismissal to shatter against it. His chest tightened with fear, but beneath the fear was something sharper. His mind was already alive with the answer. It pulsed through him like lightning, desperate to escape, desperate to correct the lie that had just been spoken and etched into the room as law. He didn't need time to think. The equations, the logic, the patterns were all there waiting to pour out. Malik's heart hammered so hard he wondered if the people in the row ahead of him could hear it. His throat felt dry, his lips parting and closing in hesitation. But the truth inside him pressed harder than the fear. And it was in that fragile space between trembling and speaking that something shifted. From the far left of the hall, a young woman's eyes lingered on him. She was no student. She wore a plain black dress, her laptop unopened on the desk in front of her. Her name was Elena Morales, Caldwell's graduate assistant. Unlike the others, her face didn't hold amusement or irritation. It held something else, recognition. Recognition of the stubborn tilt of his chin, the trembling that wasn't weakness but resistance. She had felt it before. As the only Latina in a program where her ideas were often dismissed until echoed by male peers, Elena knew what it meant to sit with brilliance in your chest while the world told you to stay silent. And now, watching this boy, she felt a spark of solidarity she hadn't expected. Caldwell, however, didn't notice her gaze. His attention was locked on Malik, his voice dripping with contempt. "Well, cat got your tongue? Or was this just a stunt for attention?" The words stung. Malik's cheeks burned again, and his stomach twisted. But even as the humiliation pressed down, the flame inside him flickered, refusing to die. Because Malik wasn't here for attention. He hadn't even wanted to be here. His mother had insisted he sit in on the seminar after a librarian, who'd seen his notebooks, made a call and pulled a few strings. "It's a chance," she had said. "Just sit, listen, learn." Malik had promised he would. But now, as Caldwell's voice tried to shrink him, he felt that promise burning away. This wasn't just about listening anymore. This was about survival. His hand remained high, and his voice, though still trapped in his throat, began to form in his mind. He replayed the professor's conclusion. Impossible. Caldwell had dismissed the entire hypothesis, chalk dust still clinging to his fingers like residue of authority. But Malik had already seen the flaw. The small crack in the equation that no one else had noticed. He could explain it, he could show it. And the thought of staying silent, of letting another dismissal bury him, was suddenly unbearable. For the first time, Malik leaned forward in his seat, his shoulders squared, his small frame seeming to grow with the weight of his resolve. The sound barely escaped, more breath than word. But Caldwell seized it instantly. "Enough." His hand slashed the air like a gavel, silencing what little sound Malik had made. "I will not indulge theatrics. You have no place in this discussion. Sit down." The dismissal was final, cutting, humiliating. And yet, Malik didn't move. The flame inside him burned brighter now, fed not in spite of the disrespect but because of it. Every ounce of arrogance in Caldwell's tone reminded Malik of the teachers who ignored him, the competition judge who erased him, the neighbors who muttered that his mother should focus on keeping him in line, not pushing him ahead. This wasn't just about math anymore. This was about every time the world told him to know his place. And his place, he realized now, wasn't in silence. He raised his chin, his lips parting once more. Before he could speak, however, the unexpected twist struck. From the third row, a student whispered just loud enough for others to hear. What's the harm in letting him try? The hall rippled with tension. It wasn't defiance, not directly, but it was enough. Enough to make a few heads nod slightly, enough to shift the room's balance. For the first time, Caldwell wasn't the only voice. The professor stiffened. His authority had never been questioned in this hall. Not like this. He turned sharply toward the whisperer, eyes narrowing. This is a university seminar, not a circus. If you want sideshows, you're in the wrong place. But his voice carried strain now, a thin crack in the steel, and Malik heard it. The boy's courage surged. The laughter had faded. The mockery had weakened. The silence was no longer suffocating. It was waiting for him. His hand lowered, not in surrender but in preparation. His small palm settled on the desk as he leaned forward, his breath catching, his body trembling but his eyes fierce. The words were ready. The answer pulsed in his chest, demanding release. For the first time in his life, Malik wasn't waiting his turn. He wasn't waiting for permission. This was his turn, whether they wanted it or not. The professor's gaze bore into him, a command unspoken in his eyes. Don't you dare. But Malik dared. His lips parted once more, and this time, he did not stop himself. He opened his mouth, ready to challenge the impossible. He opens his mouth, ready to challenge the impossible. The first words left Malik's mouth in a voice thinner than he intended. His throat was dry, his breath shallow, but the sound carried in the silence of the hall. Professor, he said, small but steady, you made a mistake. For a heartbeat, the world froze. Then came the laughter. It started with one sharp exhale from the front row, then spread like wildfire. Students shook their heads, stifled chuckles, exchanged glances that said it all. How could this child dare correct him? A few laughed openly, their voices rising in disbelief, the sound bouncing off the marble and wood, swelling into a chorus of ridicule. Malik's cheeks burned, his stomach twisting as though he'd swallowed stones. Every instinct screamed at him to stop, to retreat, to disappear. He could almost hear the playground jeers of years past, see the smirks of teachers who'd written him off. It was the same sound, laughter used like a weapon, laughter that told him he didn't belong. But he forced himself to breathe, because while their laughter rang loud, his logic rang louder in his mind. He swallowed, lifted his chin, and spoke again. You said the series collapses after the third stage, Malik continued, his voice trembling but gathering strength. But that only happens if you assume the variable stays constant. If you account for the He paused, his eyes flicking toward the chalkboard. The equations Caldwell had scrawled across it. It seemed to shimmer, not as symbols of authority, but as proof of the flaw Malik had already solved in his notebooks at home. If you account for the shift, he repeated, firmer this time, it doesn't collapse, it expands, it keeps going. The laughter wavered. Not because they understood him, not yet, but because his certainty didn't match their amusement. Malik pressed on, his words tumbling out faster now, his fear giving way to the unstoppable momentum of truth. You treated the sequence like it was locked, like it couldn't evolve, but it can. That's why it doesn't stop. That's why it's not impossible. Silence returned, heavier than before. Some students exchanged glances, their amusement thinning into hesitation. A few leaned toward their notebooks, tracing the professor's equation, rechecking the lines as if Malik's words had planted a seed of doubt they couldn't ignore. At the front of the hall, Caldwell's jaw tightened. His smirk had frozen, his expression hardening into something colder. His hand gripped the edge of the podium, knuckles white, and Malik, seeing it, felt a rush of heat in his chest. For the first time, it wasn't just laughter surrounding him. It was something else, something closer to listening. But then the unexpected twist came. From the back row, a voice cut through. That's cute. Kid thinks he's Einstein. The hall erupted again, this time sharper, more mocking. The laughter returned, harsher than before, like a whip cracking through Malik's fragile courage. The words echoed, bouncing inside his skull. Cute, kid, Einstein. His chest caved. For a split second, he almost folded, almost sank back into his chair. But then the smallest sound. A cough. Not mocking, not derisive. Just a cough, followed by the low rustle of paper. Malik's eyes darted downward. It was Elena Morales, the graduate assistant. She wasn't laughing. She was staring hard at the equations, her brow furrowed, her pen scribbled furiously across her notebook. her lips moving silently as she traced his logic. And then without looking up she muttered, "Wait." It wasn't loud. Most didn't hear it. But Malik did. And for him that single word was oxygen. He straightened in his seat, the flame reigniting in his chest. He spoke louder now, his voice no longer timid but pressing, urgent. If you test it against the third variable, it doesn't fall apart. It stabilizes. It actually stabilizes stronger than before. The hall shifted again. Laughter faltered mid-breath. Pen scratched paper. Eyes narrowed. Because the boy wasn't just speaking. He was building. His words weren't guesses. They were precise, deliberate, layered with logic that demanded attention. Caldwell's chest rose sharply. He forced a laugh, thin and brittle. "Amusing," he said, his tone dripping with false composure. A child throwing around big words he doesn't understand. But his voice carried strain now, and the students heard it. Malik didn't stop. His words rushed out, relentless. "You think the system ends because you stopped looking, but it doesn't end. You just didn't keep going." The room went still. A young man in the second row bent over his notebook, running calculations. His face shifted, confusion giving way to unease. A woman behind him whispered, "But if he's right, don't." Caldwell snapped, louder than he intended. The word cracked like a whip, silencing the murmurs. His mask was slipping, the calm authority crumbling at its edges. And Malik saw it. He saw the fear in the professor's eyes. The fear of losing control. Malik leaned forward, his small frame taut with determination. "It's not impossible," he said again, louder this time. His voice rang in the hall, not just as defiance but as truth. For the first time in his life, he wasn't invisible. And the room knew it. The laughter had died completely now. What lingered instead was unease, a current of doubt that rippled through the hall, growing stronger with every second Malik refused to be silenced. At the podium, Caldwell's eyes narrowed, hard as flint. His voice dropped low, sharp as a blade. Enough. But his tone betrayed him. He wasn't silencing Malik anymore. He was silencing the doubt creeping into the room. And everyone could hear it. The professor's eyes hardened, realizing he is losing control. The unease in the lecture hall hung heavy, vibrating just beneath the surface of silence. Malik's voice had pierced the room, dismantling certainty piece by piece. Laughter had died, replaced by the slow hum of pens scratching, minds recalculating, whispers stirring. And Caldwell felt it. The authority he had spent decades cultivating was slipping, grain by grain, under the weight of a child's trembling defiance. He couldn't let it continue. With the sharpness of a man pulling the reins of a runaway horse, Caldwell's voice cracked through the hall. Enough. The sound boomed, bouncing off the walls, making even the most skeptical students flinch. He straightened to his full height, his presence swelling larger than life, a storm pressing down on a single flame. His glasses caught the overhead light, flashing like a warning. "This," he jabbed a finger toward Malik, his tone dripping venom, "is nonsense. Absolute nonsense. Words strung together to mimic logic. But logic it is not." He didn't wait for Malik to respond. His voice rolled forward, pounding, relentless. "This is what happens when you indulge the undisciplined. This boy," he paused, deliberately choosing the word boy, twisting it sharp enough to draw invisible blood, "has no training, no foundation, no right to even be here. And yet here he is, interrupting, embarrassing himself, wasting our time." A hush swept the hall, heavier than before. Malik sat frozen, the words striking like blows he couldn't dodge. Nonsense. No right to be here. Boy. Each phrase pressed down on his chest until it felt hard to breathe. But Caldwell wasn't done. He turned back to the chalkboard, slapping the equations with his palm, chalk dust scattering like sparks. "This work, ladies and gentlemen, is built on rigor, on years of study, not the ramblings of a child who thinks he's discovered something because he doodled in a notebook." Gasps rippled. The insult was deliberate, brutal, meant to crush not only Malik's courage but any flicker of doubt among the students. To Caldwell, humiliation was not collateral. It was strategy. Malik's face flushed hot. His notebooks. His late nights under dim light, scribbling numbers while his mother folded laundry, while exhaustion pulled at his eyelids. Every piece of himself poured onto those pages, dismissed in a single sneer. His fists clenched under the desk. He wanted to shout back, to force them to see, to understand, but the words caught in his throat. Caldwell pressed harder. You see, this is why discipline matters, he said, pacing the stage, his voice dripping with authority. We do not hand microphones to children. We do not mistake boldness for brilliance. We must not confuse confidence with competence, because if we do, we open the door to chaos. Students nodded hesitantly, some out of agreement, others out of fear. Caldwell's authority was so deeply entrenched that many clung to it instinctively, even as the seeds of doubt pushed against their grip. Malik lowered his gaze for the first time, the weight of humiliation settling. His arm ached, his chest heavy, his voice silenced not by logic, but by cruelty. But then, an unexpected twist. Elena Morales shifted in her seat. She wasn't laughing. She wasn't nodding. Her eyes darted between the chalkboard and Malik, her brow furrowed in concentration. She scribbled furiously, her pen scratching across the page. And slowly, her lips parted. He's not wrong, she whispered. It wasn't loud, barely audible. But the students around her stiffened. A few turned to look, and Malik heard it. The faintest flicker of hope surged in his chest. Caldwell, however, caught the movement. His eyes snapped toward Elena, narrowing. He didn't speak to her directly. That would give her words weight, but his glare was a warning, sharp and unyielding. He pivoted back to the audience, raising his voice again. Mark my words, he declared. This so-called theory collapses under scrutiny. There is nothing here. Nothing. Do not be seduced by the illusion of brilliance. This is not knowledge. It is noise. His words cut deep, wrapping Malik's small body in ridicule like chains. The boy sat motionless, eyes stinging, throat burning, humiliation pressing down harder than ever before. But as Caldwell spoke, something else began to stir. A student in the second row, the same one who had whispered earlier, scribbled in his notebook, his brow furrowed, his pen tapping nervously against the page. Another student leaned over to peek, her eyes widening slightly. The unease was back. Not loud, not bold, but growing. Because the more Caldwell tried to crush the boy, the more brittle his certainty sounded. Malik lifted his eyes again, barely, his gaze sweeping the room. And for the first time he saw it. Not just mockery, not just dismissal, but doubt. Small, fragile, flickering, but real. His chest rose, shaky but steady. The humiliation still burned, but beneath it, the spark of defiance refused to die. Caldwell, sensing it, leaned forward over the podium, his eyes sharp as glass. His words were a blade, meant to cut Malik down once and for all. You do not belong here, he hissed. And the sooner you understand that, the less pain you will cause yourself. Know your place. The phrase echoed like a verdict. Know your place. The words his teachers had spoken in different forms. The words his competitors had implied when they dismissed his victories. The words the world had been whispering since he first opened a book too advanced for his age. But Malik sat frozen, torn between the sting of those words and the fire they fueled. Because even as humiliation pressed in, even as laughter tried to drown him, he could feel it, the doubt spreading like cracks in glass. And a few stunned faces in the audience began to wonder. What if the boy was right? But a few stunned faces in the audience began to wonder. What if the boy is right? The lecture hall buzzed with a strange energy, not laughter, not full belief, but a crackling unease that refused to settle. Malik sat small in his seat, his chest rising and falling with the weight of humiliation and defiance tangled together. Caldwell's words, nonsense, boy, know your place, still echoed inside him. But so did something else. The faces. A few of them. Not many, but enough. Faces that had shifted, eyes that had narrowed, brows that had furrowed. Doubt had taken root in the soil. Caldwell had believed impenetrable. And one pair of eyes burned brighter than all the rest. Elena Morales sat halfway down the left side of the hall, her notebook open, her pen moving furiously. She wasn't laughing, wasn't whispering, wasn't even pretending to hide her focus. Her gaze kept darting between the board and the boy, tracing the equations Caldwell had scrawled, overlaying them with Malik's words. Her pulse quickened with every line she drew. Because he wasn't wrong. He wasn't polished. His words lacked the crisp structure of academic language, and his delivery was raw, childlike. But the core, the spark was there. The shift he had mentioned, the stabilization, it made sense in a way that Caldwell's dismissal could not erase. Her heart pounded. She knew what this meant. If she spoke up, if she so much as suggested the boy had a point, She would be stepping into dangerous territory. Caldwell did not tolerate dissent, not even from colleagues, much less from his assistant. To contradict him publicly was professional suicide. She had seen it before. Students who dared challenge him suddenly found their research unsupported, their opportunities evaporated, their careers stalled before they even began. And she was just an assistant. Latina. First in her family to even step foot in a graduate program like this. She had clawed her way here, fought through the dismissals, the quiet prejudices, the subtle doors closed in her face. One wrong move, and all of it could crumble. Her pen scratched harder against the page, her breath shallow. But then she looked at the boy. Malik sat stiff, his fists clenched on the desk, his eyes wide but unyielding. The humiliation on his face was raw, open, undeniable, and yet beneath it, a fire still flickered. He hadn't lowered his gaze. He hadn't run. He reminded her of herself, of the girl she had been at 16, sitting in a physics classroom, answering a question too quickly, too confidently. The teacher had laughed, a sharp dismissive sound, and said, "Good guess, Elena, but maybe let the boys take this one." The sting of that memory lived inside her still, years later, a scar she carried in silence. Now watching Malik, she felt the old wound reopening. Her jaw tightened. She couldn't sit still. But how? If she challenged Caldwell outright, he'd destroy her. If she kept silent, the boy would be crushed, erased like so many before him. Her mind raced for a third option. Something in between. Something subtle. Caldwell's voice thundered again, reclaiming the room. "Let this be a lesson," he declared, his words heavy as stone. "Brilliance is not a costume you can wear. It is earned. And what you've just witnessed is not brilliance but arrogance." He turned his glare back toward Malik, satisfied, expecting the room to nod in agreement. Some did. Out of fear, out of habit. But not all. Elena saw it. She saw the hesitation in the second row, the nervous tapping of pens, the sideways glances. Doubt was spreading, fragile but real. Her breath caught.
Maybe.
Just maybe, the boy didn't need her to topple Caldwell. Maybe all he needed was the smallest push. Her fingers gripped her pen so tightly the plastic cracked. She lifted her hand, not high, not bold, just enough to draw attention from the students beside her. She leaned toward them, whispering softly, deliberately, "Check the stabilization. He's not wrong." The girl beside her blinked, startled. "What?" "Look at the shift," Elena said again, her voice firmer now. "If you calculate it, it holds. He's not wrong." The student frowned, her eyes darting to the board, then back to her notes. She bent her head and began to scribble. Elena's pulse raced. It wasn't a direct challenge. Caldwell hadn't noticed. But a ripple had begun, small but dangerous. And Malik, though he hadn't heard her words, saw the student scribbling, saw her sudden intensity, saw that he wasn't entirely alone. The fire in his chest brightened, faint but undeniable. Caldwell, sensing the shifting current, tried to tighten his grip. He launched into another dismissal, his voice sharp, biting, meant to drown the last flicker of dissent. "We must not let ourselves be distracted by noise. Remember, knowledge demands discipline. And discipline means shutting out voices that have no right to enter the conversation." But even as he spoke, Elena felt the room sliding. The doubt was growing. And Malik, though silent now, had planted something Caldwell could not easily rip out. Her chest tightened. This was it. The moment. She could either let the boy drown under Caldwell's voice, or she could risk everything to throw him a lifeline. Her hands trembled. She imagined the fallout, the glares, the whispered warnings from colleagues. She imagined Caldwell's cold fury, the doors that would close before she even reached them. But she also imagined Malik, walking out of this hall broken, humiliated, silenced for life. And the thought was unbearable. Elena closed her notebook with a sharp snap. The sound drew a few startled glances. She rose from her chair slowly, her knees weak, her heart hammering against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to sit back down, to stay quiet, to survive. But another voice, one she hadn't listened to in years, whispered louder. "If not you, then who?" Her hands clenched at her sides, her chest lifted, her legs steadied, and with deliberate resolve, Elena took a step forward, ready to intervene. She takes a step forward, ready to intervene. Elena's step forward changed the air. Subtle, but undeniable. The students noticed. Caldwell noticed. And Malik, sitting small but burning in the back row, noticed too. It was like a thread had been pulled taut across the hall, linking them together. The boy with the raised hand, the assistant with the trembling resolve, the professor who could feel the ground slipping beneath him. Caldwell cleared his throat, sharp and deliberate, trying to reel the room back under his control. His voice thundered, meant to suffocate dissent before it grew. "This has gone far enough," he declared. "I will not waste another breath on foolishness. Mathematics is not a playground, and it is not here to indulge fantasies. We deal in truth, not childish games." But his words landed differently now. A few students still nodded obediently, but more exchanged uneasy glances, pens scratched against notebooks, quietly testing Malik's logic in the margins. The tension had shifted, the laughter was gone, and where ridicule had once drowned him, curiosity now stirred. Elena's chest tightened. The boy had planted something the professor couldn't crush, not easily. And then Malik did something no one expected. He stood. His small frame rose from the oversized seat, his sneakers still not touching the floor, but his spine straight, his chin lifted, his voice, though trembling, carried with a clarity that forced silence back into the hall. "You said it collapses," Malik began, his eyes locked on Caldwell, "because you stopped looking." The words hung in the air like a challenge. A ripple of whispers surged, then faded. Malik's hands gripped the edge of the desk in front of him. His voice grew steadier. "But if you keep going, if you test the third variable against the shift, it doesn't collapse, it balances, it grows." He pointed at the chalkboard. His small finger, trembling but certain, directed every eye in the room. "You treated the sequence like it was locked, but it's not locked. It moves. It has to move." Gasps. Audible this time. A sound that rippled like wind through leaves. Students bent lower over their notebooks, scribbling, checking, rechecking. One girl pressed her pen to her lips, her eyes widening, as numbers lined up where Caldwell's certainty had once ruled. Caldwell froze. His jaw clenched, his grip tightening around the podium, until his knuckles blanched. Because Malik wasn't speaking in riddles. He wasn't flailing. He was making sense. And worse, the room could feel it. Elena's heart pounded in her chest. She scribbled furiously in her own notebook, testing his words, tracing the equations. Her breath caught when it held. It actually held. The boy was right. Her stomach flipped. She wanted to stand, to shout it, to validate him in front of everyone. But fear pressed her down, her body frozen between loyalty to survival and duty to truth. Meanwhile, Malik pressed forward, words tumbling faster now, fueled by adrenaline and desperation. "You said it was impossible," he said, his voice louder, steadier. "But it's not. It only looks impossible if you stop in the middle. If you keep going. If you don't give up." His voice cracked, but he pushed on, his chest rising and falling in sharp bursts. "It's not impossible. It's bigger than that. It's infinite." The word infinite dropped like a stone into still water. The hall shuddered. Students exchanged wide-eyed looks. One boy in the front row scribbled equations so quickly his pen nearly tore the page. Another girl muttered, "No way. But oh my God, he's right." The hum of disbelief spread. Caldwell slammed his palm against the podium. "Enough," he roared, the mask fully slipping now. His face flushed, his voice thundered. "Do not be fooled by parlor tricks. This is not scholarship. This is mimicry. A child parroting words he doesn't understand." But his fury carried a hollow edge, because beneath his shout was fear. Malik stood still, his chest heaving, his small fists clenched at his sides. He could feel the room teetering, the balance shifting. For once, the laughter wasn't swallowing him. For once, they were listening. And then came the unexpected twist. A student raised her hand. It wasn't Malik this time. It was a young woman in the third row, her voice tentative but clear. "Professor, what if he's right?" The hall gasped. Caldwell's head snapped toward her, his face twisting. "What did you say?" The girl swallowed hard, but didn't retreat. "What if he's right? If the shift holds," she pointed at her notebook, her hands trembling, "then his sequence doesn't collapse. It balances. It works." A wave of murmurs crashed across the room. Students leaned into their notes, whispering, calculating, checking. The tension swelled like a tide that Caldwell could no longer command. Malik's chest surged with heat, a mix of fear and exhilaration. Someone else had said it, out loud. The professor's eyes darkened, his composure cracking wide open. Silence, he barked, his voice raw now, stripped of polish. He snatched the stack of notes from his podium and slammed them shut with a violent crack that echoed across the hall. Chalk dust swirled. Papers trembled. Every student flinched. The world had just turned upside down. The professor, red-faced, slams his notes shut. The room held its breath. The laughter had long since dissipated, replaced by a tension so thick it clung to the walls. Students glanced nervously between Malik and Caldwell, whose face was now flushed with a mix of anger and humiliation. The professor had slammed his notes shut, his hand gripping the podium so tightly, his knuckles had turned white. His breath came in sharp, controlled bursts. He had lost control, something Malik had never seen before, something that sent a shiver through his spine. But there was no time to savor this small victory. Caldwell's voice cut through the quiet like a whip. "I warned you," he said, his words slow, deliberate, and cold. "This is what happens when you let the unqualified speak in spaces they don't belong." Malik's heart sank, but he stood tall, his hands clenched at his sides. He had expected this, in a way. The laughter, the ridicule, those were expected. But the venom now in Caldwell's voice was different, more dangerous, sharper, meant to pierce through the layers of confidence Malik had fought so hard to build. "You do not belong here," Caldwell continued, his voice now carrying a chilling edge. "This is why children don't belong in serious discussions. They disrupt, they waste our time. They drag down the intellectual rigor of places like this." The words were like a slap, each one landing harder than the last. Malik's breath caught in his throat, but his resolve stiffened. He had heard the world say you don't belong here far too many times. On playgrounds, in classrooms, from teachers and peers alike. It had always stung. But now, in the face of this attack, the sting was sharper, deeper. He could feel the weight of the professor's gaze, the heavy judgment that tried to push him back into his seat, to shrink him down, to make him small again. But Malik didn't shrink. The room was silent, waiting for him to break, waiting for him to back down. The students watched, their eyes flicking between the boy who had dared to challenge the great Professor Caldwell and the professor who had so easily wiped away that challenge. Malik's jaw clenched. He could feel the fight within him burning hotter now, fed by the cruelty in Caldwell's words. "I'm not a child," he said, his voice low but unwavering. Caldwell's lips curled into a tight smile, one that wasn't kind, that wasn't amused. It was the smile of a man who knew how to break someone, how to force them back into their place. "Of course you are," Caldwell sneered. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. You don't understand the work, the dedication, the years it took to get here. You think because you've read a few books, because you've scribbled down some equations in a notebook, that you can walk into this room and take part in an intellectual conversation. No, boy." He spat out the word boy like it was a curse. The word struck Malik harder than anything before it. The weight of it hung in the air, thick and suffocating. It wasn't just a word. It was a reminder of every time he had been treated as less than, of every time his potential had been overlooked, of every time his identity had been used as a weapon to keep him small. Malik's hands trembled, but his feet remained firmly planted. His eyes, sharp as knives, stayed fixed on Caldwell. "Do you understand now?" Caldwell asked, his voice growing more menacing. "This is why you don't belong here. Because you think you're entitled to something you haven't earned. You think your little notebook gives you the right to stand in this room, to take the spotlight, to challenge people who have worked their whole lives for their place here." Malik's breath came quicker, but he didn't flinch. He couldn't. "You're a distraction," Caldwell spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "An embarrassment, an interruption to the serious work happening in this room. You think you can prove something? You think you've earned this?" He gestured broadly, as though encompassing the entire room. "You don't belong. And your place here, your presence, is an insult to everything this institution stands for." Malik's stomach twisted, but the fire within him only grew. He had been waiting for this moment, for the attack that always came when someone like him, a black kid, uninvited, too bold, stepped into spaces meant for the privileged, the established. He had faced this same venom in countless classrooms, countless hallways, in every room where they told him to wait his turn, to quiet down, to know his place. And now, standing before this man, this figure of authority, Malik understood something more. They only feared him because they knew he could take their place. His voice trembled at first, but it grew steadier with every word. "I do belong here. I earned my place here. I don't need to prove anything to you. The professor's expression hardened. He narrowed his eyes, his face red with rage. He was no longer the professor. He was a man backed into a corner, willing to say anything, do anything, to preserve the dominance he'd worked so hard to build. You're right, Caldwell sneered, leaning closer. You don't need to prove anything to me. His voice dropped, dripping with venom. But you do need to prove it to every person in this room who actually deserves to be here. Because right now all you've done is waste their time, make a mockery of their hard work. The words cut deeper than any criticism he had thrown before. They weren't just about Malik's intellect. They were about Malik's existence, about his very right to be in this room, to challenge the order of things. The subtle message was clear. His blackness, his youth, his very presence made him a threat. Not because of what he knew, but because of who he was. Malik's eyes flared with anger. He didn't want to feel it, but he couldn't stop it. The weight of the attack, so personal, so cruel, suffocated him. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the words of his mother echoing in his mind. You are not less than anyone. Don't you ever let them make you feel small. Caldwell straightened up, wiping a hand across his forehead, as though he'd just delivered a blow, as though his power had been restored. You'll learn one day, he said, his voice dripping with false kindness. One day, you'll understand why I said what I did. Maybe then, you'll stop wasting everyone's time. The silence that followed was thick, heavy, suffocating. The students shifted in their seats, eyes flicking from Malik to Caldwell, then back again. But no one said anything. No one dared. Malik's heart pounded in his chest, but he did not back down. The words stung. But he would not let them control him. The words sting deeper than any dismissal, but the boy does not back down. The slam of Caldwell's notes still echoed when the next voice rose. It wasn't Elena this time, nor Malik. It came from the far side of the hall, where a man in his early 40s leaned casually against his desk, arms folded, lips curved into a half-smile. Dr. Victor Harland. Every student in the room knew his name. A rising star in the mathematics department. Harland had built his reputation on chipping at Caldwell's empire, never enough to topple him, but enough to make him a thorn. The rivalry between them was quiet, professional on the surface, but sharp-edged beneath. And now, Harland smelled blood. Well, Harland said, his voice smooth, almost amused. It seems the great Caldwell has met his match. And by the looks of it, from the most unlikely source. The room shifted, whispers spreading again. Harland's tone dripped with mock sympathy, but his eyes gleamed with something else. Calculation. Caldwell stiffened. Don't start, Victor. But Harland only smiled wider. Why not? We've all witnessed it. The boy has just exposed a hole in your theory. Quite publicly, I might add. He gestured toward Malik with a sweep of his hand. I, for one, find it refreshing. Malik blinked. For a moment, hope flickered. Someone else was speaking for him. Someone powerful, respected, with authority. But the warmth of that hope quickly cooled. Because Harland's words didn't lift Malik up. They pinned him down. Of course, Harland continued, strolling casually down the aisle. We can't seriously claim he understands what he just did. He's 12. A prodigy, perhaps, but raw, untamed. What he needs. He paused for effect, his eyes scanning the students. Is guidance. Malik's stomach twisted. Harland's smile was wide now, his teeth flashing like a predator who had cornered his prey. What he needs, Harland repeated, is someone who can take these sparks of brilliance and shape them into something real. Something usable. Someone who can take credit. He caught himself chuckling as if to soften it. I mean responsibility for developing his gift. The room stirred with uneasy laughter, some nervous, some eager. A few nodded, already buying into Harland's narrative. Elena's fists clenched at her sides. She could see the trap forming. Malik's triumph was being rewritten right in front of him. Shifted from ownership to dependency, from his genius to Harland's potential project. Caldwell's face burned red, but not with humiliation now, with rage at being outmaneuvered. He had tried to silence Malik, but Harland had seized the moment, twisting it into a weapon not against the boy, but against him. Harland looked directly at Malik now, his voice dropping into a mock gentle tone. You're clever, son, remarkably clever, but brilliance without direction is wasted. Don't you think it would be better if someone helped you, made sure your ideas reached their full potential? The words dripped like honey, sweet but suffocating. Malik froze. His mouth opened, but no sound came. He knew what was happening. Harland wasn't defending him. He was claiming him, reframing his work as raw material to be molded by someone older, whiter, established. Malik was no longer the author of his discovery, just a footnote in someone else's career. The betrayal cut deeper than Caldwell's insults, because at least Caldwell had been honest in his disdain. Harland's betrayal wore the mask of kindness, of validation, while stripping away Malik's ownership entirely. The students leaned forward, watching the exchange like spectators at a match. Some looked sympathetic, but none spoke. None intervened. Alina's breath came quick and sharp. She could see Malik's shoulders tightening, the flicker of fire in his eyes dimming under Harland's smooth theft. Her chest ached. She wanted to shout, to tell the room what was happening, to remind them that Malik's brilliance belonged to Malik, but fear gripped her throat. Harland's smile widened. He turned to the students. Imagine it. A boy like this, with the right mentor, could do incredible things. He could even rewrite the theories we've taken for granted. But left alone, he'll fade. He'll collapse under the weight of ideas too big for him. And then all of this, he gestured to the chalkboard, to the hall, will be wasted. The students murmured. Some nodded reluctantly, others hesitated. The shift was happening. Malik's triumph was dissolving, recast as Harland's opportunity. Malik's chest tightened until it hurt. His voice trembled when he finally spoke. I don't need you to explain my work. I already did. Harland chuckled, his tone dripping with condescension. Of course you did, son, and it was very impressive. But let's be honest, you didn't really understand it, did you? You stumbled onto it. A lucky accident. That's all. The words struck harder than Caldwell's insults. Caldwell had dismissed him as unworthy. Harland was stealing his very victory. Malik's fists balled. It wasn't an accident, he said, louder now, his voice cracking but fierce. I worked it out. I stayed up for nights. I filled notebooks. I proved it. The room went quiet. Tension thick. But Harland only tilted his head, his smile cruel beneath its polished veneer. Of course you think you did. But genius isn't just about having ideas. It's about knowing what they mean. And that, son, you don't know. Malik's throat burned. His triumph, the moment he thought was his, was being stolen in plain sight. Caldwell, though seething, stayed silent. Letting Harland twist the knife was easier than admitting defeat himself. The betrayal was complete. Malik stood frozen at the chalkboard, chalk dust still clinging to his small hand, his victory dissolving into a trap he hadn't seen coming. And the faces staring back at him weren't celebrating him anymore. They were questioning, doubting, deciding whether to believe Harland's smooth theft or Malik's trembling truth. The boy's moment of triumph suddenly becomes a trap. The slam of Caldwell's notes still echoed when the next voice rose. It wasn't Elena this time, nor Malik. It came from the far side of the hall, where a man in his early 40s leaned casually against his desk, arms folded, lips curved into a half-smile. Dr. Victor Harland. Every student in the room knew his name. A rising star in the mathematics department, Harland had built his reputation on chipping at Caldwell's empire. Never enough to topple him, but enough to make him a thorn. The rivalry between them was quiet, professional on the surface, but sharp-edged beneath. And now, Harland smelled blood. Well, well, Harland said, his voice smooth, almost amused. It seems the great Caldwell has met his match. And by the looks of it, from the most unlikely source. The room shifted, whispers spreading again. Harland's tone dripped with mock sympathy, but his eyes gleamed with something else, calculation. Caldwell stiffened. Don't start, Victor. But Harland only smiled wider. Why not? We've all witnessed it. The boy has just exposed a hole in your theory. Quite publicly, I might add. He gestured toward Malik with a sweep of his hand. I, for one, find it refreshing. Malik blinked. For a moment, hope flickered. Someone else was speaking for him. Someone powerful, respected, with authority. But the warmth of that hope quickly cooled. Because Harland's words didn't lift Malik up. They pinned him down. Of course, Harland continued, strolling casually down the aisle. We can't seriously claim he understands what he just did. He's 12. A prodigy, perhaps. But raw, untamed. What he needs. He paused for effect, his eyes scanning the students, is guidance. Malik's stomach twisted. Harland's smile was wide now, his teeth flashing like a predator who had cornered his prey. What he needs, Harlan repeated, is someone who can take these sparks of brilliance and shape them into something real, something usable, someone who can take credit. He caught himself chuckling as if to soften it. I mean responsibility, for developing his gift. The room stirred with uneasy laughter, some nervous, some eager. A few nodded, already buying into Harlan's narrative. Alina's fists clenched at her sides. She could see the trap forming. Malik's triumph was being rewritten right in front of him. Shifted from ownership to dependency, from his genius to Harlan's potential project. Caldwell's face burned red, but not with humiliation now, with rage at being outmaneuvered. He had tried to silence Malik, but Harlan had seized the moment, twisting it into a weapon not against the boy, but against him. Harlan looked directly at Malik now, his voice dropping into a mock gentle tone. You're clever, son. Remarkably clever. But brilliance without direction is wasted. Don't you think it would be better if someone helped you, made sure your ideas reached their full potential? The words dripped like honey, sweet but suffocating. Malik froze. His mouth opened, but no sound came. He knew what was happening. Harlan wasn't defending him. He was claiming him, reframing his work as raw material to be molded by someone older, whiter, established. Malik was no longer the author of his discovery, just a footnote in someone else's career. The betrayal cut deeper than Caldwell's insults, because at least Caldwell had been honest in his disdain. Harlan's betrayal wore the mask of kindness, of validation, while stripping away Malik's ownership entirely. The students leaned forward, watching the exchange like spectators at a match. Some looked sympathetic, but none spoke. None intervened. Elena's breath came quick and sharp. She could see Malik's shoulders tightening, the flicker of fire in his eyes dimming under Harlan's smooth theft. Her chest ached. She wanted to shout, to tell the room what was happening, to remind them that Malik's brilliance belonged to Malik, but fear gripped her throat. Harlan's smile widened. He turned to the students. Imagine it. A boy like this, with the right mentor, could do incredible things. He could even rewrite the theories we've taken for granted. But left alone, he'll fade. He'll collapse under the weight of ideas too big for him. And then all of this, he gestured to the chalkboard, to the hall, will be wasted. The students murmured. Some nodded reluctantly. Others hesitated. The shift was happening. Malik's triumph was dissolving, recast as Harlan's opportunity. Malik's chest tightened until it hurt. His voice trembled when he finally spoke. I don't need you to explain my work. I already did. Harlan chuckled, his tone dripping with condescension. Of course you did, son. And it was very impressive. But let's be honest. You didn't really understand it, did you? You stumbled onto it. A lucky accident. That's all. The words struck harder than Caldwell's insults. Caldwell had dismissed him as unworthy. Harlan was stealing his very victory. Malik's fists balled. It wasn't an accident, he said, louder now, his voice cracking but fierce. I worked it out. I stayed up for nights. I filled notebooks. I proved it. The room went quiet. Tension thick. But Harlan only tilted his head, his smile cruel beneath its polished veneer. Of course you think you did. But genius isn't just about having ideas. It's about knowing what they mean. And that, son, you don't know. Malik's throat burned. His triumph, the moment he thought was his, was being stolen in plain sight. Caldwell, though seething, stayed silent. Letting Harlan twist the knife was easier than admitting defeat himself. The betrayal was complete. Malik stood frozen at the chalkboard, chalk dust still clinging to his small hand, his victory dissolving into a trap he hadn't seen coming. And the faces staring back at him weren't celebrating him anymore. They were questioning, doubting, deciding whether to believe Harlan's smooth theft or Malik's trembling truth. The boy's moment of triumph suddenly becomes a trap. The air in the lecture hall had shifted once again. What moments earlier felt like triumph now curdled into suspicion, a low hum of voices moving like wildfire through the crowd. Could he have copied it? One voice whispered. Maybe he read it somewhere. Another added. No way a kid that young figured this out alone. The murmurs spread quickly, branching like cracks across glass. It wasn't open ridicule anymore. It was something sharper, more insidious, doubt clothed in reason. Doubt that stole the brilliance from Malik's hands and repackaged it as theft. Caldwell felt it and seized it. This, he said loudly, his tone regaining steadiness, is exactly what happens when you let children pretend to play with scholarship. He's repeating something he must have overheard, something he doesn't fully grasp. It isn't his. The students shifted uneasily. Some nodded, others frowned, their pens scratching, their eyes flicking between Malik's small frame and the equations still holding firm on the board. Malik's chest tightened. The whispers slithered into his ears, coiling in his stomach like poison. He had stayed up nights, filled pages no one had asked to see, poured his entire self into ideas he hadn't even known had names. And now, in front of the world, they wanted to erase him with one word: plagiarism. Elena's fists clenched. She had seen this before. Ideas stolen, credit shifted, brilliance erased under the guise of correction. Her voice burned in her throat, but fear still held it hostage. And then, as if to strike the final blow, Harlan spoke. "Perhaps the boy is gifted," he said smoothly, pacing the aisle like a man delivering a sermon. "But genius does not exist in a vacuum. Who gave him access to these ideas? Who guided him? Who ensured he had the tools?" His eyes swept the room, landing briefly on Elena before sliding away, surely not on his own. A dangerous hum of agreement rippled. Malik's heart pounded. His throat burned. Not on his own. That phrase, so polished, so reasonable, hurt worse than Caldwell's open insults. It told the world that even if he was right, it wasn't his. He wanted to scream. To tell them about the nights alone at the kitchen table, the thrift store books, the notebooks hidden under his bed like treasure. He wanted to shout that no one had helped him, no one had guided him, no one had believed in him, except his mother, who worked herself to exhaustion just to keep the light on for him to read. But his voice caught, his chest heaved. And that was when the twist came. A reporter at the back, her pen moving furiously, called out, "If you're saying it's not his, then whose work is it?" The question sliced the room in half. Every head turned to Caldwell, to Harlan, to the chalkboard. For the first time, Caldwell hesitated. His mouth opened, then closed again. To name another would invite comparison, and the comparison would reveal that Malik's logic wasn't copied. Harlan's eyes narrowed. He smiled thinly, covering the hesitation with another polished line. "That remains to be seen. But you mark my words, it cannot have originated here." He gestured at Malik with a sweeping hand, dismissive and final. The students murmured again. Some skeptical, some convinced. Malik felt the floor tilting under him. His victory, the one moment where he thought he had broken free, was slipping away. The room that had cheered his defiance was now rewriting the story. He was no longer a genius, but a suspect. And the worst part, the storm was moving beyond these walls. The reporters scribbled, their eyes gleaming, their stories already forming. Plagiarism, child prodigy, or fraud. The headlines practically wrote themselves. Elena saw it too. She stepped closer, her voice urgent, directed only at Malik. "You have to prove it's yours. Show them what's in your notebooks." Malik's breath caught. His notebooks, his secret, his treasure, the pages filled with equations, diagrams, messy handwriting, ideas no one had asked to see. He had never shown them to anyone, not his teachers, not even his friends, only his mother, who didn't fully understand but always nodded with pride. Those notebooks were his last defense, his proof. But if he revealed them, they would no longer be his. They would be dissected, claimed, twisted, stolen. He stood frozen, trapped between survival and loss. Caldwell seized the hesitation. "Notice his silence," he said coldly, his voice gaining strength. If this work were truly his, he would have evidence. But he doesn't, because it is. The students shifted again, the tide moving back toward him. Elena's voice broke through. "Don't let him take it from you," she whispered. Malik's hands trembled. His chest burned. His entire life, every dismissal, every silencing, every quiet night with his notebooks, pressed down on this single moment. He could let them bury him, or he could risk everything to prove himself. The reporters leaned forward, their pens ready. The students watched, torn. Caldwell's smirk returned. Harlan's polished smile gleamed. Malik lifted his head. His eyes, dark and burning, swept the room. "I can prove it," he said softly, but firmly. The whispers stopped. The air grew still. One chance. That was all he had. One chance to prove that what he carried belonged to him, and him alone. And he had to do it before the media storm turned him from a genius into a ghost. He has one chance left to prove himself before the media storm arrives. The lecture hall had become a crucible, heat pressing in from all sides, silence thick and unyielding. Malik stood at the chalkboard, chalk dust still clinging to his fingertips, his body trembling but his eyes locked. On the other side of the stage, Professor Caldwell bristled like a man on trial, his authority balanced on a knife's edge. Every seat was filled with students who no longer leaned lazily in their chairs, but sat upright, pens hovering, breath shallow. For the first time, the room was not united behind Caldwell's authority. It was divided, restless, waiting for what came next. And what came next was unavoidable. Enough games, Caldwell snapped, his voice sharp as shattered glass. He stepped closer, his shoes clicking hard against the polished floor. If you think you've proven anything, boy, then let's see it tested. Here. Now. Malik's chest tightened. He had expected this, the challenge, the trap disguised as a test. But he also knew something Caldwell didn't. He was ready. I already showed it, Malik said, his voice quiet but steady. Caldwell's laugh was hollow, brittle. You scribbled on a board. Parlor tricks. Mathematics is not proved by theatrics. It is proved by debate. He turned sharply toward the audience, his voice swelling with false confidence. So let's have it. A debate. Right here. Let's show these students the difference between disciplined truth and childish delusion. Gasps rippled across the hall. A debate between a 12-year-old boy and one of the most renowned professors in the country. Malik's pulse raced, but his feet did not move. He nodded once, slowly, as though sealing a pact. Fine. The hall erupted in whispers. Caldwell's face hardened. He had expected fear, retreat, collapse. Instead, the boy's acceptance stung like defiance sharpened into steel. They faced each other now. Professor and child, authority and challenger, power and defiance. The room seemed to tilt toward them, gravity itself bending around the confrontation.
Caldwell struck first.
You claim the sequence holds beyond collapse, he said, pacing like a predator. Yet you ignore the fundamental principle of entropy. Systems decay. Always. Unless you're suggesting, he sneered, that this one little trick of yours defies the very laws of nature. His words rang heavy, his delivery sharp. Students nodded, clinging to the familiar cadence of his authority. Malik swallowed. Fear rose in his chest, but so did memory. Memory of nights tracing the sequence over and over, checking every variation, every shift. He remembered his mother's voice reminding him to eat, her pride when he explained ideas she didn't fully understand but loved anyway. No, Malik said, his voice firm. It doesn't defy the laws, it follows them. You just stopped too soon. You looked for collapse, so that's all you saw. But if you keep going, he stepped toward the board, his small hand pointing to the chalk marks. It balances. The decay isn't an ending. It's a shift, a reformation. You called it collapse, but it's actually transformation. Whispers surged, pens scratched furiously. A few heads nodded, eyes widening. Caldwell's jaw clenched. He had expected stammering, not coherence. He struck again. Transformation requires consistency. He shot back. Stability. Your model introduces chaos. Chaos does not lead to order. It destroys it. Malik's heart hammered. He could feel every eye on him, waiting, testing. His lips trembled, but his voice steadied as the fire in his chest grew. Chaos doesn't always destroy, he said. His words came faster now, carried by conviction. Sometimes it creates patterns you couldn't see before. You call it noise, but it's not. It's another kind of order, one you didn't expect. Gasps. Audible this time. Because it wasn't just an argument. It was poetry woven with logic, defiance laced with precision. Elena sat frozen, her chest aching with pride and fear. The boy was holding his ground, not just against Caldwell's math, but against his presence, his cruelty, his power. Caldwell's face reddened. He stepped closer, his voice rising. You think you can stand here and redefine the laws of mathematics? You think your little theory means more than centuries of scholarship? Malik's hands balled into fists. He wanted to shrink, but he didn't. His voice cracked, but he pushed forward. I think it means you were wrong. The words landed like a hammer. The room erupted, gasps, murmurs, sharp intakes of breath. Some students turned in their seats, whispering furiously. Caldwell froze, his face contorting, his authority punctured by the sharp simplicity of the boy's defiance. You arrogant, Caldwell started, but his voice faltered, because Malik wasn't backing down. You told me I don't belong here, Malik said, his voice rising with every word. You told me to know my place. But I do know my place. And it's right here proving that you were wrong. Silence. Absolute silence. Every student sat motionless, their eyes locked on the boy at the board. Elena's hands trembled, her breath caught in her throat. Even Harland, lurking in the shadows of the rivalry, leaned forward, stunned. Caldwell's chest rose and fell in sharp bursts. His face was crimson, his authority collapsing with every second of silence that stretched. Malik's eyes, burning, locked on him. And then came the line. The line that would echo long after the chalk dust settled. You called it impossible, Malik said, his voice steady, cutting through the stillness. But impossible was just the word you used when you stopped trying. The room went still. No whispers, no notes, no laughter. Just silence, sharp and undeniable. The boy delivers the line that silences the room. The silence after Malik's words was suffocating. Impossible was just the word you used when you stopped trying. It echoed, bouncing in the air long after his small voice had gone quiet. Every student sat frozen, as though afraid even to breathe. Professor Caldwell's face burned crimson, his jaw tight, his fingers clawing the podium as though it could anchor him in place. His empire had never felt so fragile, so cracked, so near collapse. And then, like water seeping through stone, the cracks widened. A voice rose from the middle rows. He's right. Another followed. It holds. I checked it. Whispers swelled into words. Words into declarations. Not all, not even most, but enough. Enough to shift the air. Enough to remind Caldwell that his voice no longer commanded complete obedience. Elena's chest surged with adrenaline. She rose fully from her seat now, her notebook clutched in her hand. I verified it, she said clearly, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. The sequence holds. His explanation works. The hall gasped. A graduate assistant speaking against Caldwell was unthinkable. But there she was, standing straight, refusing to shrink. Caldwell turned on her, his voice sharp with venom. Yeah. But before he could finish, a metallic click cut through the air. A camera. At the back of the hall, a young man with a press badge had raised his lens. A second reporter lifted a phone, red light blinking. A third whispered frantically into her recorder. News had arrived. The whispers turned into ripples of panic. Students straightened, some adjusting their clothes, others ducking their heads. Caldwell froze, the fury on his face shifting into calculation. Cameras meant exposure. Exposure meant headlines. And headlines meant the story could no longer be controlled. Malik's chest tightened. The heat of every gaze on him grew unbearable. He had wanted to be heard, but he had never imagined this. Lenses pointed at his small face, microphones being raised, questions whispered in hurried tones. Who is he? One reporter hissed. 12 years old? Another muttered. Is that true? Elena stepped closer to Malik, as though to shield him, her eyes locked on the reporters. He's the one who solved it. Write that down. He's the one. Caldwell slammed his fist on the podium. This is outrageous. This child is not a scholar, he is a disruption. You have no right. But the reporters weren't listening to him. They were listening to the room, to the whispers, to the evidence scrawled in chalk across the board behind Malik. They snapped photos, scribbled notes, sent hurried messages out into the world. Caldwell's voice had always been the loudest in this hall. But now it was drowned out by the relentless click of shutters, the buzz of recorders, the sound of truth escaping his grip. He knew it, and Malik saw the fear in his eyes. The students shifted, no longer afraid of Caldwell's authority, but afraid of being caught on the wrong side of history. Some moved closer to Malik, asking hurried questions. How did you? Can you explain it again? Their voices weren't mocking anymore. They were hungry, curious. For the first time, Malik wasn't invisible, but being seen came with weight. Too much weight. His chest heaved, his small body overwhelmed by the crush of attention. The same voices that had mocked him minutes ago were now rushing to him, crowding him, demanding more. The cameras flashed. The reporters shouted. Elena tried to steady the chaos, but it was spreading too fast. Caldwell's face twisted with desperation. He raised his voice above the noise. This is my classroom. I will not have it turned into a circus. But his words cracked. The louder he shouted, the less they carried. Because for once, the room wasn't listening to him. They were listening to Malik. Elena stepped closer, her voice steady. Say something, she whispered to him. Don't let them rewrite it. Say it's yours. Malik's lips parted. He wanted to speak, but the words stuck. His throat was dry, his mind racing, the weight of responsibility pressing down on his 12-year-old frame. He had wanted them to listen. He hadn't been ready for them to hear. And then, the unexpected twist. Harlan stepped forward again. His voice, smooth as oil, cut through the frenzy. Let's not get carried away, he said, holding up his hands as though to calm the storm. A boy has done something remarkable, yes, but let us remember, he is still a boy, and boys cannot carry the burden of discovery alone. The reporters turned their cameras toward him. He smiled, polished and predatory. What this child needs, Harlan continued, is mentorship. Someone to shape his ideas, to protect him from the wolves already circling. Otherwise, his brilliance will be wasted. And that would be the true tragedy. The room tilted. Malik's moment was being stolen again, not by silence this time, but by exposure. His genius was no longer invisible. It was currency, and others were already reaching to spend it. Caldwell's fury darkened, but he stayed quiet, calculating. Harlan was no ally, but his words gave Caldwell cover, a way to avoid admitting fault, without yielding entirely. Malik's fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to shout, to scream that it was his, that no one had handed it to him, that no one had stayed up with him through the long nights, that no one had believed in him, except himself. But the cameras kept flashing, the voices kept pressing, the weight kept crushing. Elena touched his shoulder gently. Don't let them take it, she whispered. Malik lifted his head slowly, his eyes wide and dark locked on the swarm of lenses and microphones in front of him. And for the first time he understood the true cost of being heard. It wasn't just about proving the professor wrong. It was about surviving what came after. The cameras flashed again, blinding him, drowning him in light. He looked up, his small face caught in their glare, overwhelmed by the weight of what he had just done. The boy looks up at the flashing cameras, overwhelmed by the weight of what he has just done. The lecture hall was no longer just a room. It had become a stage, a courtroom, and a battlefield all at once. Chalk dust still hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. The boy who was never meant to be seen stood at the center of it, his small body dwarfed by the board behind him, but his presence undeniable. Malik Thompson had done the unthinkable. He had silenced a professor who built an empire on impossible. The cameras caught every second, their shutters rapid, their lights flashing in bursts that made the room feel less like a classroom and more like a trial unfolding in real time. Reporters whispered into microphones, their voices carrying Malik's name out into the world beyond those walls. But victory did not feel like freedom. Malik's chest heaved, the adrenaline still coursing through him. His fists remained clenched, not in triumph but in tension. He had won, but he was only 12, and every word, every sneer, every attempt to erase him clung to his skin like shadows he could not shake. Caldwell stood stiff at the podium, his authority shattered. His eyes darted across the room, desperate for a foothold, but the ground had shifted. His voice, once the only one that mattered, had been drowned out by truth. Elena Morales, notebook still in her hand, stepped closer to Malik. She placed herself beside him, a quiet but deliberate gesture, not as his savior but as his witness. The sight was not lost on the students, nor on the reporters scribbling furiously. This changes everything, one muttered. Another whispered, a prodigy at 12. But Malik didn't feel like a prodigy. He felt like a boy who had been forced to carry too much. His mind replayed Caldwell's words. Boy. Disruption. Know your place. Even in victory. Those wounds ached. Because they weren't just words from one man. They were the chorus of a world that had been telling him the same story all his life. And now, that story was out in the open. By evening the headlines spread. 12-year-old prodigy shocks elite university. Professor humiliated as child genius flips theory. Prodigy or plagiarist. Heated debate. Erupts. Malik's face, once invisible, now filled screens. The image of him standing at the chalkboard, chalk dust on his hands, eyes burning with defiance, became a symbol shared across the nation. But the story was fractured. For every voice praising his brilliance, another questioned it. For every headline celebrating him, another cast doubt. Too good to be true. Who really wrote those notebooks? Did the boy stumble onto something he didn't understand? Malik, only 12, found himself the subject of a debate he hadn't chosen. His name, once ignored, was now shouted in places that never would have spoken it before. And the cost was heavy. At school, classmates who had never spoken to him before whispered behind his back. Teachers who once dismissed him now eyed him with suspicion, unsure whether to treat him as a genius or a fraud. Strangers online picked apart his identity, his family, his neighborhood, searching for reasons to believe or disbelieve. Elena watched it unfold with a mix of pride and dread. She had stepped forward too, and the consequences were real. Caldwell's allies closed ranks against her. Opportunities she had been counting on began to vanish. But she did not regret it. She knew what it meant to be erased, and she would not let Malik face it alone. Caldwell, though disgraced, did not disappear quietly. In interviews he spoke of unfortunate theatrics and a tragic manipulation of a child. His words dripped with false pity, but beneath them burned resentment. He could not undo the moment, but he could still poison it. Parland, meanwhile, circled like a vulture, he appeared in news segments, smiling, speaking of mentorship, and guiding the boy toward real scholarship. To the untrained eye, he sounded supportive, but Malik could hear the theft beneath every polished phrase. And through it all, Malik felt the weight pressing harder. He had wanted to be seen, but he had not wanted this. At night he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his notebook stacked at his bedside. The numbers that once brought him joy now felt like chains. He thought of his mother, her tired smile as she whispered, "Your voice matters." He thought of his grandmother's words, "If you wait too long, your turn never comes." He hadn't waited. He had spoken. He had been heard. But at what cost? 1 week later, the university announced an investigation. Words like plagiarism and fabrication lingered in the air, even as his proof remained undeniable. The institution could not erase the equations, so it tried to erase the boy behind them. Elena stood by him, her voice steady in interviews, her notes published online for anyone to see. Slowly, the tide began to turn. Students spoke out, verifying what they had witnessed. Reporters replayed the footage, showing Caldwell's cracks, Harlan's opportunism, Malik's steady defiance. And though the debate raged, one truth refused to die. A 12-year-old black boy had stood in the heart of an elite institution and proved the impossible wrong. That image, small hand raised against a room designed to ignore him, spread further than even the chalk on the board. It became a symbol, for every child told to wait their turn, for every student silenced in classrooms, for every voice dismissed as noise. Malik Thompson became more than a boy in a lecture hall. He became a question the nation could not ignore. Should he have ever been doubted? And yet, Malik remained just that, a boy, a child forced to bear scars too early, to carry weight too heavy. His victory was real, but so was the cost. One evening, weeks later, as the storm raged on outside, Malik sat alone in his room, his notebooks open before him. He lifted a pencil, his hand hovering. For the first time he hesitated, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he wondered what it would cost to write it down. His mother entered quietly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to prove anything to them, baby," she whispered. "You already did." Malik looked at her, his eyes tired but fierce. "But if I stop now, then they win." She nodded slowly, pride and sorrow mixed in her gaze. And then, as if the universe wanted to remind him, the news played faintly from the living room TV. A clip of him in the lecture hall flashed across the screen, his small hand raised high, trembling but unyielding. The same gesture that had been ignored, mocked, dismissed, now replayed, remembered, unforgettable. The boy who was never meant to be seen had become impossible to forget. The story closes as his hand, once ignored, is now the most unforgettable gesture of defiance. Stories like this don't just live in classrooms. They happen every day, in silence, in shadows. If you believe voices like Marcus's deserve to be heard, type yes in the comments. And if this broke your heart, subscribe so more people can never look away again.